Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So I got to say, what is worse than spending 21 minutes talking on a video only to have the sound not working? So hopefully the sound is working this time. It looks like it is. And what I'm going to do is rehash the keys to Ukrainian victory in this ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And first, please understand the likelihood of what you would define as a Ukrainian victory at this point is fairly remote and is going to be incredibly challenging for the Ukrainian state. And then you have to look at what do you articulate as a victory in terms of Ukraine. Is it fighting the Russians until a standstill and some sort of armistice? Is it pushing the Russian forces out of the areas that the Russian military has seized after the onset of hostilities? Or is it pushing the Russian forces out of all areas of Ukraine to include the Crimean Peninsula, which again is very, very remote at this point. And then you also have to look at what are the Russian war goals and war aims at this point as well. And obviously that could have a sliding scale depending on who the decision maker is and what their conditions of victory are as well. But for the Ukrainians to ultimately which would be a large-scale counteroffensive to evict Ukrainian forces from currently controlled areas, is going to be very, very challenging. And first and foremost, the Ukrainians are going to need to be supplied with ultimately an air force and a very robust air defense network, probably equipped with a very large amounts of Western air defense systems such as Patriot, PAC 3s and 2s, ground-to-air AMRAAMs, Spiders, maybe Israeli Spiders, really just a host of systems, really first designed to prevent Russian air activity over Western Ukraine, and then more importantly, establish a air defense zone that runs along central Ukraine, extending from north of Kiev down the Dnieper River, which would allow the Ukrainians to then deploy and send reinforcements and supplies into eastern Ukraine. And then ultimately, the West would have to supply enough arms and armaments to reconstruct a lot of these Ukrainian combat brigades that have been seriously degraded over the last 60 plus days by this very, very intense Russian artillery attack that has been continuing unabated for many, many weeks now, and is causing quite extensive casualties in terms of manpower and equipment for Ukrainian forces. But let's start first, again, with the concept that the West would have to supply large amounts of air defense systems. And then once the Ukrainians were able to establish first an air defense zone, an effective air defense zone over Western Ukraine and then in central Ukraine as well, they would then have to find a way to deploy some sort of air force to eventually establish air dominance in conjunction with those air defense systems, those long-range air defense systems, into the eastern areas of Ukraine. And again, in conjunction with some sort of air force that could be a drone-based air force. It could be the deployment of possibly up to well over 100 either Gray Eagle or TB2 Bayraktars operating en masse in conjunction with this very large scale air defense network that the West would have to help the Ukrainians undertake and create. and that would require the Ukrainians sending, in all probability, large amounts of forces and soldiers to these NATO states such as Poland, Slovakia, Romania, to train and then equip these formations, these air defense formations, to then redeploy in western Ukraine and other areas. And then eventually, the training and deployment of this drone capacity, first in western Ukraine and then expanding probably towards eastern Ukraine once they have the ability to deny Russian tactical aircraft assets, and in some cases shoot down a good number of Russian cruise missiles and ballistic missiles as well. But that's a long way off, and then also we just don't know if the West is going to actively supply the kinds of systems in mass that would be required for the Ukrainians, not just to have air defense zones near Kiev or Lviv or some other cities in the West, but in fact basically establishing air denial for Russian forces along all of western Ukraine, and then eventually central and then eastern Ukraine. And then to make matters more challenging is the reconstruction of these Ukrainian heavy brigades and motorized rifle, mechanized tank brigades, re-equipped probably with Eastern equipment, but also equipped with Western equipment as well. And that is going to be a very, very large, lengthy endeavor for the Ukrainians to achieve the ability eventually to launch a not just multi-battalion types offenses that we are seeing right now, but actual multi-brigade or even corps level counteroffense operations against Russian forces. So a long way off for that, and given the high pressure campaign that is currently ongoing by the Russians, the likelihood of that occurring is fairly remote. And mainly that is the risk of escalation, where if in fact we start to see the large-scale deployment of Ukrainian forces first training in Poland, Romania, possibly other states, that could lead to that direct escalation by Russian forces attacking some of those sites, and then leads to what I think would ultimately become a fractured NATO against Russia and Belarus. And that obviously could possibly lead to Russian forces looking at the Baltic states to launch some sort of operation, and then ultimately the Third World War that would in all probability take place. So very, very difficult at this point for what I would say a Ukrainian victory, and not just a fighting until a armistice under the current conditions and the current territory acquisition that the Russians have made, but ultimately a large-scale counteroffensive that we keep hearing the Ukrainians talk about, but really, is it feasible? And at this point, I would say no, without quite a bit of effort from Western nations. One, training quite a few Ukrainians in the West, or having the ability to deliver huge amounts of arms to the Ukrainians. I think at this point, especially the Biden administration, is really looking at just curtailing Russian advances and trying to fight to some sort of stalemate that they envision would at some point occur because of Russian losses. But the Russians right now are adapting to this current conflict. As I talked about in previous episodes, the types of strategies that the Russians are using right now, namely the widespread and very heavy use of long-range fire systems. This is what is really hurting the Ukrainian ability to sustain itself in the field against Russian forces. There have been repeated anecdotal reports taken all over varying hospitals and facilities that are treating wounded Ukrainian service personnel. And what is being said by those forces clearly states that they are having a very, very rough time with this current Russian strategy that is being deployed. So at some point, again, in order for a Ukrainian victory, the Ukrainians are going to have to change that status quo. And first, that is going to be the ability to defend Ukrainian airspace with air defense systems, and then proceed to attack those Russian sites with drones or long-range fires of their own that would have to be provided by Western sources. And we're just not seeing that happen in the levels that would be required ultimately for a Ukrainian victory. I know that's tough to hear for the Ukrainian side, but it is simply the facts on the ground that are happening right now. And until the Ukrainians are able to adapt and change the current status on the ground, especially in terms of this Russian pressure campaign, it's going to be very, very difficult for the Ukrainians to achieve ultimately what they would define as a victory. And again, there's various variations on what you would define as a victory. Is it a holding pattern under the current conditions? Is it driving Russian forces out of the existing territorial gains, or is it a push all the way into the Crimea and the original boundary lines of the eastern separatist forces that existed in Luhansk and Donetsk prior to the outright hostilities that are currently existing? But you're going to have to see the deployment and handover to the Ukrainians of dozens of Patriot PAC-3s, PAC-2s, dozens upon dozens, hundreds of HIMARS and M777s, and then eventually the ability to hand over to the Ukrainians large amounts of drones that would be able to operate in eastern Ukraine against those Russian forces. And that would first only be able to really take place if that air dominance via the air defense systems that the Ukrainians would use in eastern Ukraine. And again, that's going to take some time for the Ukrainians, if in fact the West makes a said move towards that ultimate outcome, which right now doesn't look likely. It looks more like the West is just willing to give the Ukrainians enough to stem the current Russian tide of offensive operations and make it a de facto basically standoff, and neither side gains significantly at this point. And that's the way it's, at least that is the strategy that the West right now is pursuing. That's not obviously the strategy that the Russians are pursuing. The Russians are continuing this high pressure campaign, and right now they are still effectively are instituting that high pressure campaign, which in my opinion will ultimately lead to the possible collapse of the Ukrainian forces, and you'll probably end up seeing some rapid territorial gains at a certain point by Russian forces. But it's going to take time, pressure, and this continued Russian strategy employed, unless the West is able, and the Ukrainians, in conjunction with the West, are able to change that status quo right now that the Russians are instituting against Ukrainian forces. But again, my apologies for the earlier video that had no sound, and obviously we'll continue to monitor, report, and provide you with content for your consumption. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day.